Well, good afternoon. Today we're going to look at chapters 16, 18, and 20 for week 26. So, late 19th and early 20th century Latin America marked a period of increased U.S. involvement in Latin American affairs. The U.S. emerged as a global power after the Spanish American War in 1898. Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, which asserted U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904 to the Monroe Doctrine justified U.S. intervention in Latin America. Now, the U.S. sought to protect its economic interests and maintain political stability in the region. The Panama Canal's construction in a 10-year period between 1904 and 1914 heightened U.S. strategic interests in Central America and the Caribbean. U.S. intervention coincided with the rise of banana republics and the U.S. corporations, particularly the United Fruit Company. Yet things like dollar diplomacy, which was U.S. foreign policy that prioritized economic interests and used financial incentives to achieve political goals. Gunboat diplomacy, the use or threat of naval forces to advance U.S. interests and influence foreign governments. The U.S. believed that their sphere of influence, where they would be dominant, exercising their political, economic, and military control. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary indicated that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American countries to maintain stability and protect U.S. interests. Now, prior to that, you had the Platt Amendment in 1901, where the U.S. imposed an amendment to the Constitution of Cuba that granted the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. That naval base still exists today, although no longer is the U.S. intervening. The construction of the Panama Canal was very strategic because it connected both Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, and it led to the creation of Panama seeking its independence from Colombia. Now, the U.S. intervened in Latin America, first in Cuba between 1898 and 1902, which led to Cuban independence, but with significant U.S. influence, as I mentioned, with the Platt Amendment. Panama, or as I mentioned, the U.S. Intervened, allowing Panama to secede from Colombia. And then again, multiple times in Nicaragua between 1912 and 1933. The U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua to protect U.S. business interests and support the conservative government against liberal revolutionaries. They even tried to build a canal, but it was unsuccessful in the Bryan Chamorro Treaty in 1914, which granted U.S. exclusive rights to build a canal in Nicaragua. Then we have the Haitian intervention between 1915 and 1934, where the U.S. Marines occupied Haiti following political instability, controlled the country's finances and government. And then you also had the Dominican Republic intervention, 1916 to 1924. U.S. military occupation was in response to political unrest and to protecting U.S. economic interests. Then you also had U.S. intervention partially during part of the Mexican Revolution between 1914 and 1917, where they occupied Veracruz in order to protect U.S. interests and to influence political outcome. So why did the U.S. intervene? Well, economic interest for one. They wanted to protect and expand its business investments and trade relationships in the region. Through the U.S. Fruit Company, they had significant stakes in the region's agriculture and natural resource sectors. Political stability. The U.S. wanted to maintain friendly governments and prevent the spread of political ideologies such as communism, which was perceived as a threat to U.S. interests. And strategically, the U.S. wanted to secure its geopolitical dominance in the Western Hemisphere and prevent European powers from gaining influence. You also had racial and cultural bias. U.S. policymakers often viewed Latin American countries as inferior and in need of guidance reflecting prevailing attitudes of the time. And then, of course, domestic politics. U.S. presidents and politicians use interventionism to bolster their popularity and demonstrate American power on the global stage. Now, what influences they have on the region? First of all, you had political instability. U.S. interventions often led to the overthrow of governments and the installation of U.S. friendly regimes, contributing to long term political instability. Economic dependence. U.S. economic dominance and control over key industries, agriculture, mining, hindered the development of diverse and self sufficient economies in Latin American countries. Social and cultural. U.S. military occupations and political influence affected local societies, often leading to resentment and anti American sentiment. Sovereignty and self determination. U.S. interventionism undermined the sovereignty and autonomy of Latin American nations, limiting their ability to shape their political and economic future. And then lastly, resistance and national movements. U.S. intervention sparked resistance and nationalist movements in Latin American countries, such as the Sandino Rebellion in Nicaragua between 1927 and 1933. Now, there was a shift in U.S. foreign policy. It began with FDR's Good Neighbor policy in 1933, which was a shift from military interventionism toward non intervention and cooperation with Latin American countries. Therefore, U.S. withdrew troops from Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Policy aimed to improve relations and promote economic and cultural exchange. Pan Americanism, U.S. promoted cooperation and solidarity among American nations through initiatives like the Pan American Union and Inter American Conferences. You also had World War II. Many Latin American countries allied with the U.S. during the war, leading to increased cooperation and a temporary reduction in tensions. And then, of course, you had the Cold War interventionism. After the Second World War, U.S. foreign policy in Latin America focused on containing the spread of communism, leading to covert operations and support for anti communist governments, which we'll talk about in the subsequent next week, in Guatemala in 1954 and then in Chile in 1973. So, what resistance and reactions? Latin American intellectual and political movements, writers, artists, and politicians criticized the U.S. interventionism and advocated for sovereignty and self determination. The Uruguayan writer and Jose Enrique Rodó, in his text Ariel, contrasted Latin American spirituality with U.S. materialism. Definitely, there were anti imperialist sentiments due to U.S. interventions among many Latin American populations. You also had nationalist and revolutionary movements, as I mentioned. You had Sandino's rebellion in Nicaragua. You had the Mexican Revolution, which had elements of U.S. Resistance. And then you had diplomatic efforts. Some Latin American governments sought to counter U.S. interventionism through diplomatic means, such as the Drago Doctrine in 1902, which opposed the use of force to collect debts. So, what is the legacy and long term consequences? First off, you have strained U.S. Latin American relations. The legacy of U.S. interventionism has contributed to a complex and often tense relationship between the U.S. and many Latin American countries. Economic inequality and underdevelopment, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. U.S. economic dominance and support for elite led governments have contributed to persistent economic inequality and hindered sustainable development in Latin America. Then you also have political instability and authoritarianism. U.S. interventions and support for friendly regimes have contributed to the cycles of political instability and the emergence of authoritarian governments in some Latin American countries, particularly throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You also have ongoing debates over sovereignty and U.S. influence. The history of U.S. interventionism continues to shape discussions about sovereignty, self determination, and the appropriate role of the U.S. in Latin American affairs. You also have cultural and intellectual responses. Latin American writers, artists, and scholars have grappled with the legacy of U.S. interventionism, producing works that critique imperialism and assert cultural identity. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Pablo Neruda, for example, and the lessons for U.S. foreign policy, the mixed outcomes and long term consequences of interventionism in Latin America have prompted debates about the effectiveness and morality of such policies, influencing discussions on U.S. foreign policy in other regions. Now, Latin American populism emerged in the early 20th century as a response to the oligarchic rule and economic dominion of the foreign powers. The Great Depression of the 1930s exacerbated economic inequalities and social tensions, fueling the rise of populist movements. Rapid urbanization and industrialization in the mid 20th century created a growing working class that became a key constituency for populist leaders. The Cold War context influenced the ideological orientation of populist movements, with some aligning with socialist or communist ideas and others embracing anti nationalist or anti communist stances. Mexican Revolution and the aftermath. Now, the Mexican Revolution, spanning from 1910 to 1920, was a pivotal moment in Latin American history. It overthrew the dictator Porfirio Diaz and ushered in sweeping social and political changes that shaped modern Mexico. The revolution's legacy included agrarian reform, worker rights, and a new constitution. It also led to the rise of the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which dominated Mexican politics for most of the 20th century. The PRI, founded in 1929 as the National Revolution Party, emerged as the dominant political force in post revolutionary Mexico. It incorporated revolutionary factions and interest groups such as labor unions, peasant organizations, and claimed to be the heir and embodiment of the revolutionary ideals. Nor is this more represented by Lázaro Cárdenas, who served as Mexican president from 1934 to 1940. He implemented extensive land reforms, distributed land to peasants and indigenous communities, nationalized the oil industry in 1938, creating Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, promoted education and social welfare programs. Cardenas's policies aimed to reduce foreign influence and empower the Mexican people. He supported unions and worker rights, and he strengthened Mexico's sovereignty and economic independence. Argentina. Juan Perón served as president of Argentina from 1946 to 55, and then again, which we'll talk about briefly, 1973 to 74. He implemented populist policies aimed at improving the lives of the working classes, known as descamisados, promoted industrialization and nationalization of key industries. He faced opposition from the military and was overthrown in a coup in 1955. His wife, Evita Perón, played a significant role in his government. She served as a link between Perón and the working class, advocating for their rights. She founded the Eva Perón Foundation, which provided social assistance to the poor. She became a cultural icon and a symbol of Peronism even after her death in 1954. Peronism is a political movement based on the ideas and policies of Juan Perón. It combines elements of nationalism, populism, and social welfare. It emphasizes the importance of the working class, descamisados, and their role in society. And it continues to be a significant force in Argentine politics even after Perón's death. Now, the descamisados refer to the working class, the base of Perón's support. Perón positioned himself as a champion of the descamisados, promising to improve their lives. Then you have Justicialismo, which is social justice, a central principle. It focused on achieving social justice through the redistribution of wealth and power. It aimed to create a more equitable society and protecting the rights of workers. And lastly, you have corporatism, which involves the organization of society into corporate groups, i.e., unions, businesses. Perón believed that corporatism and the balance could balance the interests of different sectors of society. It encouraged collaboration between the state, unions, and employers to achieve social harmony. Then we have Getulio Vargas, who served as president of Brazil from 1930 to 45, and then again from 51 to 54. He implemented the Estado Novo in 37, meaning new state, a centralized authoritarian government. He promoted nationalism, industrialization, and social welfare policies. He balanced competing interests in the military, urban workers, and the elite. Vargas's legacy is complex and controversial. He is credited with modernizing Brazil and improving worker rights, but he's criticized for his authoritarian rule and suppression of political opposition. Now, the Estado Novo was the authoritarian government established by Vargas. He centralized power in the hands of the federal government, promoted nationalism, industrialization, and modernization. He implemented social welfare policies and labor reforms to gain support from the working class. The Estado Novo aimed to transform Brazil into a modern, industrialized nation. He invested in infrastructure, projects, and state enterprises, encouraged the growth of domestic industries through protectionist policies. Well, that's all I have for all of you today. Anyways, have a good day. Any questions? You know where to find me. Talk to you all later. Bye bye.